They weren't lost, they were taken, stripped from the Parthenon under Ottoman occupation, shipped to London, and held in the British Museum against Greece's will for over 200 years. The museum calls them the Elgin marbles, but to millions, they're the Parthenon sculptures. And their story isn't just about Greece, it's about justice, colonialism, and whether the world's most powerful museums will ever reckon with how their collections were really built. So today we're exposing that story and the fight to bring the marbles home. My guest is George Vardas. He's a legal and heritage expert based in Sydney, and he's been campaigning for the marbles' return since 1998. He's a co-vice president of the Australian Parthenon Association, co-founder of the Acropolis Research Group, and secretary of the Australian Hellenic Council of New South Wales. He also works with the Joint Justice Initiative, lobbying for the recognition of the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocides. And as culture and arts editor at Greek City Times, he's become a leading voice on cultural restitution and historical justice. George Vardas, welcome.
Hi, Susie. Nice to be with you.
Nice to have you, especially on this very important discussion. So a historical context first, if you may. For those less familiar with the story, what exactly are the Parthenon marbles and how did they end up in the British Museum in the first place?
Right. Well, we go back 2,500 years with the, famous Greek statesman Pericles. He had a vision for a magnificent Athens. He had a magnificent building program, and one of the buildings that he commissioned was the temple to the goddess Athena, known as the Parthenon, and he engaged a number of sculptors, including the very famous sculptor Phidias, to produce this temple and the various sculptures that were statues and pedamental sculptures and metopes and an incredible Parthenon frieze that were added to the building, reflective of the Parthenaic procession that was held every 4 years in Athens. Something that the Athenians could look up to and admire because it was atop the Acropolis in Athens. So it was a building that dominated the gaze of Athenians, and it made a statement. That building stood, as I've said, for over 2,500 years. Unfortunately, through time, the Venetian, during the battle with the Morosini, the Venetian commander of the Venetian forces that had surrounded Athens during the Ottoman occupation, because viewers would recall that Greece was under Ottoman occupation for over 400 years. In the 16th century, there was an explosion when the guns from the Morosini cannons exploded the armory of the Turkish occupying forces within the Parthenon and blew a lot of the Parthenon, or at least the roof and a number of columns, and caused extensive destruction. But it remained a glorious ruin until in the early 1800s, Lord Elgin, who is the protagonist in this story, was appointed the ambassador by the English to to Constantinople, to the Sublime Port in Constantinople, and he had the idea, influenced by his architect and by others who were advising him, that he should try to get permission to get copies of the sculptures that were still on the Acropolis, to take them back to England to inform the English of the beauty of Greek architecture and Greek sculpture. However, through nefarious means, through bribery, there is still to this day a strong argument that he never obtained an official permission or firman to do what he did. He actually physically, through his workers, they physically dismantled a number of, or many sculptures from the Parthenon, hacked them, cut them, and removed them, and progressively over a period of about 3 or 4 years, ship them back to England. By that stage, we're talking now around 1806, 1807, Elgin was in financial trouble. And eventually, he persuaded the British government to conduct an inquiry to see if they could acquire the marbles or the sculptures from him. And eventually, there was a commission of inquiry which voted to support the acquisition. They were purchased for £35,000 and immediately deposited in the British Museum, where they've remained ever since. And they were formerly known as the Elgin collection of Parthenon sculptures, and hence the very common term, the Elgin marbles, emerged.
Thank you.
In a nutshell, that's why we're now talking about something that's been there, that they were formerly transferred into the ownership of the British Museum in 1816.
Thank you for the historical backdrop. What's very interesting that I noted in that backdrop is how the Ottomans used the Parthenon as an armory, as a warehouse for their...
Yes.
Right. No respect for cultural heritage there.
Because it commands a great view of the surrounding area. But yes, unfortunately, it was exposed.
So, George, if you allow me to call you George.
Of course.
Thank you. Your recent article, link of which I will provide in the description box below,
right.
Suggests a shift in the air. Talks of long-term loans, cultural partnerships, and quiet diplomacy. But cutting through the optics,
yes.
Is Greece firmly demanding the permanent return of the marbles, or now signaling a softer stance of shared custody and indefinite borrowing?
It's the official position of the Greek government and previous governments is that they were never lawfully obtained by Elgin. The Greeks don't recognise legal ownership in the British Museum or in the British authorities, and they, for a very long time, have been asking for their return. There has been a shift. We know that Melina Mercouri was very active 40 years ago, the Secretary of Culture, who basically brought the issue of the marbles to the fore in the public eye. But in recent years, the current Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, has taken a personal interest in the return of the sculptures, and he has gone to Downing Street on a number of occasions and dealt with his counterparts, who invariably, given recent events, change from year to year. So he's dealt with a number of prime ministers, and he's made it quite clear that Greece wants them returned. And what has developed and what has transpired in the last 2 years or so is that he's also been having discussions with the chairman of the trustees of the British Museum, George Osborne, who was the former Chancellor for the Exchequer in a previous Conservative government. And there has been talk of a deal. Now, what the nitty-gritty of that deal is still up for debate. There's still a lot of pushback within conservative British cultural establishment as to allowing the sculptures to go back, or some of them, and I'll come to that very briefly. But the problem is, up until recently, it was always if I could say, the elephant in the room. You would have discussions between Greek and British politicians or cabinet ministers. The marbles would never be mentioned. However, the Prime Minister and his current Foreign Minister, Repatriation, have actually made it an important issue of Greek foreign policy. However, how they're going to come back, in what form, has become the matter for debate. And one of the issues that has arisen is that the British traditionally, and the museum, and I coined the phrase cultural catch-22. The British Museum Act says that the British Museum does not have the power to deaccession or to let go any of its artefacts in its possession. And the only way that can happen is for the British Museum Act, its enabling legislation, to be amended. On the other hand, successive governments, both Labor and Conservative, have said they have no intention of amending the Act. So and that it's a matter for the British Museum. So the question is, if there is to be a deal, how can the Greek government and the British Museum come to some arrangement that doesn't infringe the Act, but allows for an enlightened cultural cooperation arrangement to be reached, which would possibly gradually see the sculptures return, possibly not in one go, but over time. And that's where things, from my perspective, currently sit.
Thank you for that. So for our audience, you happen to mention Melina Mercouri. Melina Mercouri was Greece's former Minister of Culture, but she was also a legendary actress preceding that. She was nominated for an Academy Award, and she actually was the winner of the Best Actress at the Cannes Film Festival for her role in Never on Sunday. She spent over a decade turning the Parthenon Marbles return into a global campaign and the matter of national dignity and cultural justice. So, George, in the 80s and in the 90s, Melina Mercouri didn't just lobby behind closed doors, as is the case most recently now. She galvanized global opinion. Today, where is that same firepower in terms of public campaigns, international awareness, or diaspora activism? Has the movement lost its voice on the world stage, the movement?
No. For almost as long as Melina Mercouri was advocating the return, and she famously confronted a former British Museum director and told him in his face that they are Greek and they need to come back. There have been campaigners in Australia, in the United Kingdom, and in other parts of the world who have been lending their voice. In 2005, and there now are over 20 different national committees in existence, they formed what's known as the International Association for the Reunification of the Parthenon Sculptures. And its inaugural chairman was an Australian, my colleague, David Hill. And that brought together all these associations. The current chair is a Belgian archaeologist, Christian Titgat. And again, it is a lobby group that is pushing for the return of the sculptures. At the same time, a number of private actors have come along. When I say actors, people who have got a passion for return, and one of them is a Greek-American industrialist by the name of John Leffers, who has started a campaign called the Parthenon Project. And that is where he has actually been reaching out to British politicians, decision makers, to try to influence their thinking about the sculptures, to introduce them to this idea that you can have what is traditionally regarded as a win-win solution, where both parties, I suppose in a mediation context, could be said to be saving face, where on the one hand the British cannot be seen to be just sending them back, without anything in return, but by the same time the Greeks can say that they've achieved a meaningful resolution which brings together the sculptures reunited in the Acropolis Museum inside of the Acropolis and the Parthenon itself. So through a combination of various national committees under the umbrella of the International Association, people such as John Leffers, another individual who's come along in recent years is Roger Michael. He is a lawyer, archaeologist, who famously has used robotics to create a perfect marble replica of one of the most famous sculptures from the British Museum. And his argument is, well, I can produce replicas of what those sculptures are, which would be much more useful from an educative point of view for a museum, and thereby allowing the originals to be reunited with their siblings, those that are still surviving, in the Acropolis Museum. So, yes, there is a global campaign that is pushing and for us and it's great now that for the last few years, as I indicated, the Greek government has taken up the issue directly with the British. It's the British Museum, and not something that's just talked about, but nothing ever happened. So, what I'd like to think that there will be some positive developments, but as always, the devil's in the detail.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you mentioned earlier in the previous question that I asked is a bit concerning to me. The catch-22, maybe it's the British, their way of actually not reaching a resolution on the matter, and that's what's very concerning. I don't know how you think it's gonna end up.
Yeah, the problem is, and I could go on for hours about this. There is still a strong voice within the British cultural establishment that doesn't want to see anything come back. The previous Conservative governments talked about retain and explain. The idea was that even controversial statues that were being removed because they had connotations of slavery or other colonial attitudes, their attitude is no, we should retain them and explain their proper context. And the same with the sculptures. And the argument, the concern is that, well, if we return the Parthenon sculptures to Greece, then there'll be a slippery slope effect, and other countries will want their artifacts back. And so they're very quick to raise that. And more importantly, they also emphasise that, yes, the British Museum is a very important institution. It's more than 250 years old. It is what is generally regarded as a universal museum because it has examples of cultures from all over the world. However, it's not just a museum of and for the world, which it claims it is. It also has a moral compass that it needs to employ. And in the case of the Parthenon sculptures, the argument we say that should prevail is that the sculptures, to be best understood, must be reunited, particularly when any of your viewers who have gone to the British Museum or the Acropolis Museum will know that there are some sculptures that are divided between the two museums. You have a foot of a centaur in the British Museum, and the rest of the sculpture is in the Athenian Museum. The Acropolis Museum has one part of Poseidon's body, the rest of it is in the British Museum. That is just nuts. The Greek Prime Minister once said it's like cutting Mona Lisa's eyes out and having the Da Vinci's work, Mona Lisa, in one gallery and her eyes in another gallery. And that's where we'd like to think that common sense can start to prevail.
So since you mentioned the Acropolis Museum, well, the Acropolis Museum opened in June 2009, and it opened with dithyrambic praise from global press, including the New York Times, Le Monde, The Guardian, for its architectural brilliance and its powerful juxtaposition to the Parthenon itself.
Yeah.
So for years, the British Museum was claiming that the marbles, they can't be returned because Greece had no suitable museum at the time to house them. But that argument crumbled with the opening of the Acropolis Museum in 2009, state-of-the-art, built in full view of the Parthenon, and as mentioned, hailed by critics worldwide. So why does this outdated excuse, though, still linger sometimes in parts of the public conversation? And what role do you think the British Museum itself has played in keeping that myth alive?
Look, the British Museum at the time was under the directorship of a very astute director, Neil McGregor. And they knew, we have seen private messages from when the Acropolis Museum was still a dream, and that the museum understood that once the new Acropolis Museum was finally completed, and there were delays inevitably in constructing that museum, that the argument for the campaign would become a lot more tumultuous and harder to resist. But the British Museum did not stand still. It effectively reinvented itself. I mentioned before the expression the Universal Museum. the museum of and for the world, the collective memory of mankind. These are definitions that they've applied to themselves. And now the latest manifestation of that in the last few years, I kid you not, is the argument that, yes, the sculptures were, even if we accept that they were taken from the British Museum, from the Parthenon, they won't admit in dubious circumstances, but they were separated. But because they've been in London for more than 200 years, they tell a different story in London, that they are really now part of British culture, and they tell a different story in the British Museum, so that people to properly appreciate culture will go to the British Museum and go and look at the sculptures from the Parthenon, and then go to the Assyrian section, or go to the Egyptian section, or go across to the Chinese artifacts, to compare cultures from around the world. And that's an experience that you can only appreciate in the British Museum. That's how subtle and clever their spin has become. Of course, our argument is all we're asking for is to reunite something so that it can be best understood in its context. We're not asking for any other sculptures from that may be in the British Museum that was taken from Greece. Only what was adorning the Parthenon, because it is something that is integral to the Parthenon, and it's something that can only best be appreciated when viewed in its natural context.
Well, let's talk. You had mentioned previously about other museums and the avalanche concern, basically. Let's talk about the unspoken fear behind many major museums' refusal to repatriate looted artifacts. The British Museum, as you correctly said, was founded in 1753. It was built on the private collection of Hans Sloane, much of it acquired through colonial networks. The Louvre, on the other hand, established in 1793, was rapidly filled by Napoleon's military lootings across Europe and Egypt. And the Met in New York, though founded in 1870, the Met only began to rival the British Museum and the Louvre after acquiring the Cesnola collection in 1872. Now, here's the part that almost none of our Western viewers know, and many will be stunned to hear, is that the foundational glory of the Met was built not on Greek or Egyptian or Roman masterpieces per se, but it was on looted Cypriot antiquities from my country. The so-called Cesnola collection, in inverted commas, who was an Italian-American Civil War veteran turned U.S. consul in Cyprus, turned dealer, who excavated over 30,000 antiquities from Cyprus, many under questionable or outright illegal circumstances during the Ottoman rule, and he sold 6,000 of them off to the Met in 1872. Now, these artifacts gave the Met both its first major collection and the institutional credibility and international stature it desperately craved and lacked, because it wanted to become on the same, up to par with the British Museum and the Louvre, which it achieved with the so-called Cesnola collection. So ironically, Luigi Palma di Cesnola later became the Met's first director until his death in 1904. So do you think the return of the Parthenon marbles is seen as dangerous by these institutions, not for legal reasons, but because it might open the floodgates for global restitution demands across the board?
That is certainly something that those in the retention camp will argue. At the same time as the Parthenon sculptures dominate the headlines, there are other examples that your viewers may have heard of. The Benin bronzes that were taken by a British military expedition in Benin, in Nigeria, in the late 19th century, literally at the barrel of a gun, and dispersed all over Europe. Some of them have now been returned, and there is a thing called the Benin Dialogue, which is ongoing, trying to resolve that. Ethiopia had the Magdala treasures, Eastern Orthodox artifacts that were taken by the British Army, again in a punitive expedition, where ironically the British Museum's curator was embedded with the British military, and as the soldiers were returning from the battle, he was buying the artifacts from them. even we Australians, our indigenous Aboriginal population, a symbolic spear, the Guaigal, shield. I made an error. A shield that was seized when the first English officers arrived on the shores of Australia in 1770 is in the British Museum, and there is push for that. But again, these are isolated examples which have been referred to as the keys to a country's ancient history. As I indicated before, we're not after everything coming back, but in the case of the sculptures, we say it wouldn't create a dangerous precedent because we're simply asking for the sculptures that used to adorn a temple be reunited with the surviving sculptures that are now in the Acropolis Museum. Just as recently, the museum in Palermo in Sicily returned a fragment that had been taken from the Parthenon. The late Pope Francis gave three pieces that were in the Vatican museums that had been seized by, we don't know by whom, but certainly they found their way in the Vatican Museum. He gave them back to Greece. And there have been some examples of that in the past, because there are other fragments in other museums. The Louvre, you mentioned, has got some fragments from the Parthenon. Vienna, Copenhagen, amongst other museums, have got fragments. And our campaign is to say, we just want those items reunited. And it's interesting that you mentioned about the Cyprus precedent, because the Met has also been in the news recently because of a deal that was done by a very, very rich American art collector by the name of Leonard Stern, who had acquired over 160 Cycladic artifacts. These are the Cycladic figures that one sees in different museums. They almost certainly were seized illegally and excavated illegally from the Cycladic islands in Greece in the 1950s and 60s. I'm not suggesting Stern participated in that, but he was very quick to buy them from dealers and at auction houses, and he wanted to donate his collection to the Met. The Met contacted the Greek government, and after a number of years of negotiating, a deal has been struck whereby those items are now on exhibition at the Met, but over a 25-year period, they will gradually return to Greece. And in return, Greece will be sending other artifacts to the Met. So the Met's no stranger to this kind of contested antiquity issues. And the Cypriot issue that you raised with me, and I wasn't aware of, I have to be frank, is very interesting because Cyprus antiquity was literally looted by someone who used his diplomatic status, his consular status in Cyprus, to take advantage of the times, as did Lord Elgin in his capacity as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire back in 1801.
Yeah. Most people don't know this, that the foundational collection of the Met was where the Cyprus antiquities that Cesnola looted.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we can raise global awareness on that. That's a whole big other issue. But my final question for you today, for our international audience, what can they tangibly do, the public do, to support the marbles return? It doesn't need to be the Greeks per se, the international audience of the channel. Are there petitions, emails, or actions that might actually move the needle and help with the effort?
There have been petitions in the past. The problem is, for a petition to have an impact in the British Parliament, it has to attract at least 10,000 signatures for the British Parliament to formally, or the British government of the day, to react. And that's not really happened. There are opinion polls that take place quite regularly, which show in most cases that there is an overwhelming majority who support the return. But it's, in terms of action from other countries, speaking to your elected representatives, raising issues about how immoral it is to have these sculptures separated. A lot of these countries, such as the United States, Australia, have got substantial Greek and Greek Cypriot populations, and they can, as I have done in the case of Australia, raised it with our politicians to get a consensus to say, well, this is something that needs to be addressed. The only other thing I can suggest is I mentioned Mr. Leffis and the Parthenon project. He is very active now. He has a website called the Parthenon Project, which brings has a lot of up-to-date information. At the risk of plugging my own online newspaper contributions, Greek City Times also runs pieces from time to time about recent developments. And again, people, if they're really focused, they can contact their the ambassador in their country, the Greek ambassador, or the diplomatic corps in their country to say they support the issue and perhaps offer any assistance they can. But eventually, the decision will be taken in London by the British Museum and hopefully a British government that is proactive and understands that it's just the right thing to do. As Stephen Fry, the famous writer and actor, has said, it's simply the right thing to do. And it's what the British should be doing.
He couldn't have put it more clearly. Well, thank you, George. Thank you for shedding light on one of the most contested cultural justice issues of our time. The story of the Parthenon Marbles and the looted antiquities that built the most celebrated museums is not ancient history. It's unfolding right now.
No.
We hope today's episode has illuminated just how high the stakes are, not just for Greece, but for truth, for accountability, and for historical integrity.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and I wish you well on your noble efforts to raise awareness about the Cypriot collection at the Met and its nefarious history.
Thank you, George. Hope to have you again soon.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
If this conversation made you think, like, comment, and share it around. And don't just watch. Subscribe to Unfiltered with Sam and smash that notification bell so you never miss a drop. Stay curious, stay informed, stay unfiltered.